of IT, and I'm your presenter, Lalani Lagransi. So, welcome to everyone. And as promised, today you guys can just switch off your um, videos. So, today we're going to continue with two-dimensional arrays. Yesterday we looked at declaring them and populating them, so giving them values from a text file, random values input from the user, or maybe even in the declaration. And then also how to do calculations, but overall calculations. So today we're going to continue with calculations. Please open the chat, and if there's anything that is unclear, you ask in the chat and I will try and help you as best I can. Or if there's anything else that you guys want me to explain in the future for the last few days of this week, please let me know. So we have covered the overall highest, I think we did yesterday. Yes, highest as well as the overall average. Now, today we're going to look, and it's important to read your questions, obviously, in an exam. We are working with a two-dimensional array, for those who weren't here yesterday, that contains rows, and each row contains a learner's marks. And this array is a two-dimensional array, so it has, we've read from a text file into the array. I count R is the number of rows that we have filled for this two-dimensional array. And then we have 4 columns, each one representing the terms marked. So each learner has 4 columns and there's 4 marks for each of them. So that's our two-dimensional array. Now we're looking at the question that says, calculate and display the average for each learner. Now your question will probably stop there. When you're reading the question, you have to now look at the data, and look at your two-dimensional array and figure out, are they asking you to do a calculation per row or per column? So for our example, since it's asking for each learner and each learner is represented in a new row, that would be a row question. And when it is a row question, your first for loop has to be your for loop for the row. So that's why you guys can see here, I'm starting with a for loop for the row. Okay. When you are calculating averages, now imagine this is now almost like this teacher's spreadsheet. So it has your names in the first column and then a bunch of marks, let's say 4 marks next to you. To display the average for each learner, you need an extra column. So there would be the learner has 4 columns for their marks, but they need a 5th column to display their average in. So that's why my column counter here is 6. So it's 4 for the term marks, 1 for column 0 that's going to display the names of the learners. So that's 5, and then an extra 1 to display the average, so the 6th column. But remember, your columns all start at 0. So if you're going to loop through them, you're not going to loop from 0 to 6. Then your program will crash and you'll get an error, because you're trying to go to the 7th column, even though it's column 6. So if you're going to loop from, let's say you wanted to set the column size, you can loop from 0 to 5, because that is 6 columns. Very similar to your item index of your radio groups and combo boxes. So in the cell, remember the row goes first. The column goes first. In column 5, because the first column is column 0, so this is the last column, the 6th column. In column 5, but row 0, that's a gray row at the top of your string grid, we are going to display the word average. So that would be like a heading for each learner. It's going to say term 1 to 4 and then average. Okay, as I said, it is calculating the average per learner. So we're going to start with the for loop for the row. We want to calculate the average for all learners. So we're going to loop from 1 all the way to I count R. Very important now, our running total needs to be reset for each learner. So each learner needs to start with a new running total. That's why I'm initializing on the inside of this loop. So very often when we have a question that's asking per row or per column, we will have a begin and end. And on the inside of that begin and end, we are going to initialize some values. So this one is calculating the average for each learner. So we're initializing each learner's total with 0. You don't want to add on to previous people's totals. Then you'll be calculating an average overall. You want per learner. So on the inside here, we're initializing iTotal. And then I'm going to loop in my column counter from 1 to 4. So now I'm just going to loop through all the learners' columns. And now I'm going to add up all their marks. So in my running total, I'm going to add up each learner's mark. So let's say we're at row 1. Our row stays 1 while I'm looping from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Remember, your inner loop executes more often than your outer loop. So for every once that your outer loop executes, your inner loop then loops 4 times. Then, okay, so here I'm calculating the running total, adding up a learner's marks. Now I have their total marks, and to get the average, there were 4 terms. So I'm just going to take their total divided by 4. I'm still inside of the row of the loop for the row. Now I am calculating the average, and depending on the question, they could ask you display the average in a rich, edit the label, or store it in another array, or store it in this array in a 5th column. So I have tried to include a couple of examples for you. This is an example of taking that average now and displaying it in my string grid. Remember, I said yesterday as well, your string grid is only there to display. As you would use your rich edit, only use your string grid to display. You will lose a lot of marks for using your string grid for processing. So in my string grid, the cells I am in column 5. So the 6th column, but it's column 5 in the row I'm at. So if I'm calculating the average for learner 1, I'll still be in row 1 of my string grid. And remember, your cells has a string data type, so therefore you'll have to use your floater string F with your FF fixed and comma 10, comma 2. Well, depending on how many decimals they want to display, you're going to have to look at the screenshots for that. This example is displaying 2 decimal points. So here only is the end of my row for loop. So if I now loop again and I go to row 2, I start with a new total set to 0 for the 2nd learner's average. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. Very important is read your question. Is it a row or a column question? And start with that for loop. So here's another example. This question said, calculate and store the highest mark for each learner in the 5th column of the 2-dimensional array. So it is a row question because it's a highest mark for each learner, and learners were stored per row. And we are going to have an array. In this example, the array would be declared with 5 columns, so 1.5, and we are going to store their mark in that 5th column. So they have their term 1 to 4 marks stored in column 1 to 4. And now we're just going to store the highest one in the 5th column. Now, again, it's a row question. That's why I'm starting you with the for loop for the row. I have a begin and an end here. And what I'm doing in this first line inside of the for loop is I am setting I high to the current learner's first mark, so term 1's mark. So if I am in row 1, I'm taking row 1's mark 1 and I'm storing it as I high, so that when I get to this if statement, I high needs a value. So now I'm looping inside of this, I'm looping through the other marks of this learner. You will still get the correct answer should you have started at 1, but it would be more effective to start at 2 because 1 I've made now the highest one. So now I'm looping from 2 to 4 and I'm comparing learner 1's marks, the columns 2, 3, 4, with I high. And if any one of them at any point is higher than I high, I replace I high with that current value. So I loop through all four of, well, term 2 to 4's marks, comparing it to I high. So after this inner loop executed, I now have the highest mark of this learner stored in I high. So now what I'm doing is, as the question asked, store this mark in the 5th column of the array. So there's the array. I'm in, let's say, still learner 1. In his 5th column, I'm storing his highest mark. So whatever mark I high is will appear more than once in the columns 1 to 5. 1 to 4, it will be in there as the term mark, but then it would also be in the 5th column as the highest mark. Then I loop again, and I row now changes to 2. And then I do the same. Person 2, whoever stored in row 2, the first mark is made the highest, compare the others and store it in array mark 2, the 5th column, his highest mark. So that is really the basics of doing calculations per row and per column. Now we're getting to, per row, sorry. So now I'm going to show you guys per column. So let's say they said calculating the display the average per term. My terms were stored in the columns. So I had 4 columns, and each term's marks were inside of a specific column. Or loop for the column. Now let's just look at, well, this is also depending on the question, but here is an example for you. I see my internet is a little unstable. I'm not quite sure why. So if you guys are struggling to hear me, please send me a message in the chat so I know. In here, I now have a row counter where I use the number of items in my array, or the number of rows in my array, which is stored in iCountR, plus 2, because I have 1 for the row 0 at the top, the gray one for my rich edit, for my labeling. And then I want an extra one at the bottom that will show me the average per term. So I need an extra row. It's a column question, but where are we going to display those values of the columns? Going to display it at the bottom of each column below the data. So that's why I use the plus 2 there. Now I want to have a label. This is in column 0, so that's that left gray column of your string grid. In row number iCountR plus 1 to display the label average, also in that gray left column of your string grid. So as I said, it's a column question because we are asked to calculate per term. I'm going to loop with my for loop for the column first. And same as we did with the learners, we're going to initialize now on the inside of this for loop. We want each term to start at 0 because each term's total to calculate the average will be calculated separately. So that's why iTotal is now on the inside of this for loop. Here I'm now looping through my row counter. So I have looping through my rows from 1 to iCountR. I'm adding all the marks together for this term. Then I'm calculating the average. So I'm taking the total divided by my number of rows. And in our solution where we read from the text file, that is iCountR, storing the average. And now I am displaying in the string grid in the column I'm in. So let's say I was calculating the average for term 2, iCol will be 2. And I'm displaying it just below the data of my 2-dimensional array. My data stops in the row iCountR plus 1. So just below that, I'm displaying the average of that term. And so I loop through all the columns, calculate each starting with my total as a 0 every time. So that is an example of calculating per column. Now a rich edit, this is very important, and I haven't done the calculation, but I think for about 3-4 years, we have been asked to display in a rich edit. The 1 year we were given an option. You could pick, you had to add your own object. That only happened once ever. So you could pick whether you want to use the rich edit or the string grid. But I have seen that the trend recently is that the display is in the rich edit. So make sure that you know both methods. Now, if you think about a rich edit, it is a row question because I am displaying the data per row. I can't display data per column in a rich edit. When I'm displaying row by row. So therefore, when you are displaying in the rich edit, you're going to build a string because you can't add on to a rich edit. Once you've used .lines.add, you can't add on to it. So you have to first build a string, and then you're going to display as soon as you are done with a line of data. The top part here is now just creating headings. As we did with the string grid, those were in column 0, or row 0, the top row. So we want to display a heading called name, and then we want next to it, separated by #9s, we want to have term 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm initializing. So these strings, when we're displaying in a rich edit from a 2-dimensional array, these strings are often not initialized as empty strings, but rather as the first value. But you have to obviously read the question, but the majority of the times you're going to initialize it with something. So in both these examples, we are going to initialize it with something else than an empty string. So this display, there's my string, or my output string it's called. I'm initializing it with a label name and a #9. And now I just loop through my columns 1 to 4. And I'm building the string. I'm saying S display is assigned to S display plus the term plus a 1 plus a #9. Then I add onto that term 2 #9, term 3, and term 4 #9. After this for loop here, I am now done with that heading, and I can now display the output string S display. I can display in my rich edit. And yes, you could have done it the long way by writing a very long line of code to say name plus #9 plus term 1 plus #9 plus term 2 and so on. So you could have done that all just in the rich edit here. So that's usually a possibility in your headings, but not very clever because you can just use a loop to do the same process. But to display a 2-dimensional array, you can't do it the long way. So as I said, it's a row question. So we're going to start with a for loop for the row. And every row, remember, I want to give them the person's name first. That's like my first column in my rich edit. So I'm initializing S display on the inside of the row loop, but just before I loop through the columns. So I'm starting with the person's name. So I will start at the person who is in position 1, and I will store their name as S display. I will then loop through whoever stored in position 1. I'll loop through all the marks that is stored in row 1, column 1, 2, 3, 4. And add them to my string, my output string, with a #9 at the end. So once I have this inner loop completed itself from 1 to 4, I will have the person's name and their 4 marks separated with #9s stored in S display. Just before I then loop again through my for loop for the row, I then display this string in my rich edit. Another possibility here would be to add S display is assigned to S display plus #10 to create the enter and then only output outside of your for loop. That would also be an option. This is just usually how I do it. So both of them would be correct. So now let's say I've used this method and I've displayed the first person. Now that I loop again, I go to the person in the second row and I replace whoever was stored here in sDisplay. So the values of the person stored in row 1 was displayed there, but now I'm replacing all of that. I'm overwriting sDisplay with the next person's value. So I don't keep the old values. If you would use the +#10 method, you will have to still build here and you have to initialize sDisplay as an empty string above the loop. So yeah, I find this a little bit easier to use. Very important is that you guys actually study the code that you see in front of you now. All these videos are loaded up on the internet, so you can have a look at it again. But this is code you need to study. You are going to find two-dimensional arrays in the harder question of the question paper. So you actually want to make sure that the easy parts you will score full marks for, and that will also assist you in helping you solve the more difficult parts of the paper or that question. So the whole question isn't difficult. It's lots of easy stuff to do, like, for example, display in the rich edit. But if you still have to figure out how to display in the rich edit, you're not going to have time to problem solve your more difficult parts. Okay, so that is displaying in a rich edit. Study that code. Please do that. Now we're going to look at deleting. We'll first start with deleting a row. And I just want to show you guys this picture here because, or this representation of my 2D array, because this is what we're going to do. Let's say I wanted to delete row 3. And remember, you did the same in one-dimensional arrays. And if you haven't done so, you better practice deleting and adding to one-dimensional arrays. So I want to remove row 3. The columns is going to stay the same. But what you're going to do, we're going to start looping at the row that I want to delete. And I'm going to take the next column and place it over that column. So these top ones, row 1 and 2 is going to stay the same. So I'm not going to start my for loop there. I'm going to start the for loop for the row because I want to remove a row. And I'm going to start at row 3 or the row I want to delete and place the next row over that one. You can see so if I put 733 on top of the 464, the column is staying the same. It's the rows that are changing. Okay, so once I've done row 4 is over row 3, then I'm going to move on and I'm going to loop and put row 5 over row 4. And then I'm going to put row 6 over row 5. And at that point, row 5 and 6 will have the same value. So then I have to decrease my row counter so that I have one row less when I'm using something like a display procedure. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you guys the code for that. So I want to remove the learner in row 3. Very important is that you are going to loop from the row that you want to delete. So I want to delete row 3. So I'm going to start at row 3 and I'm going to loop all the way to the counter, but -1. Now, the reason we have this -1 here, let's just maybe show you guys that. Let's say I declared an array that had 6 rows. So my rows were 1.6. And I loop all the way to I count R, which would be 6 in that case. In my code, I'm using K + 1. So if I go K + 1, I'm going to row 7. And then my program crashes and I get that lovely access violation because it doesn't exist. So that's why we are looping to I count R -1. And the problem with this is in an exam, you will often not get that error. So because we are not always filling the array, we often don't experience that error, but then we lose the mark. So make sure you study. This is also code that you need to study, guys. Make a note of this and make sure that you study that. You don't want to lose the mark for something like a -1 there. Okay, but you understand now why we need the -1. Now, as I'm doing so, this is also revision. This first row here for array name, this is now also an example of removing an item from a one-dimensional array. So you have to know this for 1- and 2-dimensional arrays. We will use the same method, but in one-dimensional arrays, we won't have the for loop for the column. So in here, we have replaced the current person. So let's say we're looping for the first time. Our row would be 3. And then when we are going to place over that, the person who is in row 4, our row +1. So to the user, it looks like we're deleting row 3, but we are actually replacing row 3 with row 4. And then we're going to, the next time we're looping, we're going to replace row 4 with row 5 and so on. In my for loop then for the columns, the column counter stays the same. And I am now looping through all 4 terms. But remember now, my columns stay the same. I'm not moving columns. I call term 1 stays term 1. I'm just getting rid of a learner that left the school. Okay, so in here, the code looks very similar to my one-dimensional array, except that I have the column in the index as well. So our row is replaced now with the next row, but the same columns, as you can see there. Okay. Now, this next part here is really only if the question's asking you to do that. This part that's in the block here clears the name and sets the marks to 0. You can't set an array that's an integer to an empty string, so you're going to have to set it back to 0. But we don't actually have to do this if we are working with a counter like iCountR. Let's say you had a display procedure for this program. If you decrease, you deduct 1 from iCountR, even though my array now looks like this, where you can see line 5 and 6 has the same values. Since I've decreased iCountR, it was 6, is now 5. Now it is only when I call my display procedure, and I'm going to loop from k is 1 to iCountR, I'm only going to loop up to the 5th row. It is going to ignore row 6, even though it has values in it. It's going to ignore it. It's not going to be part of my processing because I'm using that variable. So this is really not needed, but a question could ask you to do it. So just read, they'll say, you know, assign the last one to an empty string. And as you can see, I'm using iCountR here because iCountR is my last item at this point. That is why I've done this before I take 1 off my row counter. Okay, so that is deleting a row from a 2-dimensional array. Again, this is code you need to study. You don't want to have to think, how am I supposed to remove a row or a column? Okay, so that was deleting a row. Now we're getting to deleting a column, and the process is very similar. We want to delete column 6. And I'm going to start at column 6. It's a column question. So I have to start with the for loop for the column. And I'm going to start at the column I want to delete. I want to delete column 6. So I'm placing 7 over 6 all the way to the end. In this instance, if we are asked, as some papers have asked us to delete columns, or those who've been doing the exams with me, the past papers, we've done that one where the weeks had to shift. That's, you know, we filled that last column as well, but there are exams that ask you to get rid of a column completely. In that instance, there will be some form of variable to keep track of your number of columns. So my example at this stage have used a counter for the rows, but if we're going to remove columns, we'll have to keep track of those columns using a column counter. So I've just said, let's say I count C was equal to 10, and this was my two-dimensional array. So column 6 is the one that I want to remove. As you can see now in this example here, I am not including the deleting of the one-dimensional array for the name because I'm not deleting a learner. I'm just deleting one of the term marks. So you're not necessarily going to have a one-dimensional array parallel to your 2D array, even though I expect we are going to. But just be aware that you still need to use your own logical thinking skills to work out what needs to be deleted and what doesn't. So in our, we're not going to add the one-dimensional array here because I'm not removing any learner. I'm just removing columns. I start at the for loop. The for loop is for the column. I start at 6 that I want to delete. And I'm looping again this column counter -1 to prevent the access violation. On the inside, I'm looping through all the rows. And while the column is 6, I'm going to each of its rows, and I am placing column 7 over column 6, but the rows stay the same. So row 1 stays row 1. I'm just moving column 7, and I'm placing it over 6. And then in the next row, when my for loop for iCol changes again, I'll put column 8 over column 7 and so on. And again, this part here is only if you are asked to reset that last value to 0. And then that would be, I'll have to loop through all the values of all the rows of the last column, which at this point will still be iCountC, because I only took the decreased iCountC here at the bottom. So this is again only if the question asks you to do that. So once you have looped, you will have, so iCountC would have changed now to 9 in this example, but the last 2 columns will be the same. But if you are using your column counter to display, you don't need to worry about that last column. Okay. Now, insert can be asked in several different ways. The easy one is that we are asked to add our two-dimensional, or to ask to add an extra row, so an extra learner at the bottom, at the end of my loop, of my two-dimensional array. That's very easy. The first thing you will have to check is if my array was declared as an index with 20 rows and 5 columns, and I want to add an extra learner, so an extra row, I first have to check if my array is not full. And this is also to prevent your access violation. So if iCountR was already 20, I can't add another learner. It will crash if I do. So that's why I just have a display message and an exit. Same process goes when you're adding to a one-dimensional array. You must also be able to add to a one-dimensional array at the end, at a certain position in a sorted array, and so on. Then once I've done this, I'm going to increment iCountR because I have this extra row. And in iCountR, I'm going to place the new values. And here on the right, that is up to the question. Maybe you're getting input from edit boxes, input boxes, maybe random values for the marks, maybe the person's entering it. That's all up to the question. This could have been in a loop as well. I just showed you guys how I would have done it for 4 terms if it was hard-coded. So that is just adding to the bottom. That's easy. Now, it is a little bit harder if I'm asked to add a person in a specific row. So if let's say I have to add the person now in row 4, I'm going to, and I'm not allowed to sort. So sorting wasn't part of the question, and I still need to produce the right output. So I can't sort. Let's say, the person needs to be in alphabetical order. That's going to be a different scenario. But let's say I have to add a row in a specific point, and that is in row 4. It's a row question, so I'm going to start with my for loop for the row. But this time I'm going to start at the end of my row. So I'm going to start at the bottom here. Let's just take this example. So let's say I'm starting at, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm starting at 6 and I'm looping down. Sorry, I'm looping down to where I want to insert the value. So I'm looping from 6 down to 4. 4 is the row that I want to insert this new person into. What I'm going to do now, and remember it's down to, again, code that you guys can study. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move everyone one row up. So the person that was in row 6 is now going to go to row 7. So that is what this first part here is doing. Let me just zoom out because I keep on going up and down. Okay. So I'm going to start at, let's say, row 7, and I'm going to put in row 8, I'm going to put the value of 7. So I'm basically making space by moving everyone one down to make space in row 4 for that person. So I'm going to move their names. Very, very important is to remember about that parallel one-dimensional array, that you move those with you. So I'm going to put that in the next row, and that is the previous row that I'm going to put over that. Then I'm going to keep the columns are going to stay the same. I just use an example of using iCountC, but we can have 1 to 4 here. And I'm going to take the mark, and in row 7, in column 1, I'm going to put the mark of row 6, column 1. Then I'm going to loop again. I'm going to stay where I have, let's say, row 7. I'm going to put column 2 in row 7. Column 2, I'm going to put the value of row 6, column 2. And so I loop all the way from 1 to 4. Let me just quickly read a question here from Skulk. Will we have to change declaration to make space for an extra row column? Skulk, you're not allowed to change the declarations of your given code. So if two-dimensional arrays are given code, we are not allowed to change it. In any example where I'm going to insert into a one-dimensional or a two-dimensional array, I always have to test if there is space. So if there is space for that person, if I have not reached my limit for the row declaration, the index row declaration, I need to then, I need to test it before I add anyone, because you may not add, change any given code. So yeah, you also may not add objects to your form. You may not change the objects of the form. I did one year have to move the reset button around because we couldn't get hold of it on our screens. But further than that, you can't change anything. Okay, so in this way, I'm moving all the columns stay the same, but I'm moving all my rows one down. And once this loop has completed, the last time it's looping is when I row is 4. So row 5 gets a value of row 4, and you'll see the red here highlighted. Now you can see that Layla's marks and her name is doubled up here in row 4 and 5. But basically what I've done is I've made space for the new learner in row 4. And all I'm going to do now is I'm going to replace the values that are currently in row 4 of my one-dimensional array and two-dimensional array. I'm going to replace that with the new values. I'm just reading the question here. So there will be space in an index if we have to add it. Yes, they have always, that's always been working, Skulk. So go and do some past papers. There are many that ask us to move rows, add columns, and so on. But the declaration should be correct for that. If you feel the declaration is wrong, that I've never seen in a paper happening. I know we've had some examples of screenshots that were wrong, but I've never had declarations being wrong. So that should be fine. Just always double check your question before you think it's a mistake in the paper. Read your question again. It's usually in the question paper, the correct answer. Okay. So this loop is done, and all I'm going to do is in row 4, and remember 4, it doesn't have to be hard-coded 4, it could be input from the user. In which row do you want to add the new learner? And then you'll replace that with the input from the user as long as it is an integer. And then I just put this, in this example, it was row 4, and in square brackets 4, maybe it's an edit box. In a loop, I could ask the person to enter the marks for term 1, 2, 3, 4. By the way, while you're seeing this input box, just make sure that you read your question carefully. There's sometimes we need to display extra information in the input box and not just what's your mark. So in this example, and then there's a mark allocated extra for displaying something like, in this case, the column counter to see term 1, 2, 3, 4. Instead of just term mark. So always make sure you read the question carefully. Okay, so that is making space for a row. And then for the column, very similar. Again, we're going to have to test if there's space. And we are going to loop. In this case, we're not adding a new learner, so I don't have values here for a new learner's name. I just have new marks because there was a new term added. So increment your counter, and in this last counter, I'm looping through all the rows, so each learner gets a new mark. And as you can see here, I've used that example again. You can maybe display now the user's name or the learner's name from your one-dimensional array inside of your input box. And then finally, this one, I think this would make sense to you guys now. Now we're going to add a column in column 2, and we are going to move all our columns. The rows are going to stay the same. All our columns are going to start at the end. And let's say we have a term 4. We're going to put the marks that was in term 4 in term 5. And we're going to move term 3 to term 4. And I want to add a new term in term 2. So now term 2 and 3 will have the same values. And then finally, I just need to add new values for each row for this new column, let's say 2 that I wanted to add. And remember to increment your column counter because you now have one more. So that is almost the end of our two-dimensional arrays. What we'll do tomorrow, I think we're going to look at sorting next, but that's not going to take us the whole day. Or, well, it's not going to take us the whole 45 minutes. And I'll go through that paper that we did last week. And then 2 of you guys said you've seen it before. So at the end, I'll go through that one again. I think it was the supplementary or the final of 2017, where we had to also move columns around. So that would be a good one to have a look at. There's no point in just watching. You guys need to practice. These questions, these final questions, really is your turn to practice. And please remember to tell me what you guys want to do next, because after tomorrow, I'll go to a SQL question, maybe of an older paper, and we can go over that. Or if you want me to explain OOP again, I can go through those rules as well. But it's up to you guys. You can send me a message in the chat and let me know what it is that you would like to do for the last 3 days of this week. So guys, thank you very much for watching. This was Grade 12 IT at STEM Lockdown Digital School. If you missed some of our lessons, they are uploaded on YouTube. If you go to the Grade Africa Teen Gigs under the Grade 12 IT playlist. And thank you very much, Africa Teen Gigs, for making this possible. And you guys can follow them on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'll see you guys tomorrow again. Same time, same link. So have a good afternoon. Bye, guys.